Thank you for the great information, Gary. June 19th, 2024. There are a lot of things converging on today as I speak. The first thing I'd like to acknowledge is we're talking about the integration of Major League Baseball, and today is Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is a national holiday. I downloaded some notes from the National Museum of African American History and Cultural website. And in June 19th, 1865, nearly 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln emancipated the enslaved Americans or Africans who were in America, Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, with news of freedom. More than 250,000 African Americans embraced freedom by executive decree in what became known as Juneteenth or Freedom Day, with the principles of self-determination, citizenship, and democracy magnifying their hopes and dreams. Those Texans held fast to the promise of true liberty for all. So I'm happy to be here on this particular day speaking. So now we'll fast forward 82 years. We could say 82 years to 1947. America was an amazing place. We had just won World War II. The economy was fantastic, and Americans were confident. If you were an American in 1947, you were working, you were watching baseball, and you were probably making babies. In fact, if you were a kid growing up in the United States, you probably wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. And you could make that happen if you had three things going for you. Number one, you had to be talented. Number two, you had to have a great competitive work ethic. And number three, because of a so-called gentleman's agreement that the baseball owners agreed upon in the 1880s, you had to be white. Now, on April 15th, 1947, Jackie Roosevelt Robinson took the field at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, becoming the first African American to play Major League Baseball in the 20th century. He was with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So, all right, baseball's integrated. Problem solved. What's next on the list? Well, not so fast. Jackie Robinson's debut was the first dramatic step of integrating Major League Baseball. There were a lot of blood, there was a lot of sweat, and there were a lot of tears that followed. It was much like July 4th, 1776. That was the first dramatic step in America gaining independence. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears followed. June 4th, 1944, D-Day, the turning point in World War II. That was the dramatic step that was followed by a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So one of the things that I enjoyed over the last couple of days, and Patricia Fripp mentioned something a little while ago about, she posts something on LinkedIn every day. And she made a great post with a flyer for today's presentation. And then one of the members, Janelle, commented that she knew a little bit about the Jackie Robinson story. And she mentioned that Jackie Robinson was chosen for a specific reason. He was the right guy to integrate Major League Baseball. And she was absolutely right. And the reason that is because Jackie Robinson, he grew up in Southern California, went to integrated schools. He went to Pasadena Community College, then went to UCLA. He was always in integrated situations. He was a four-sport athlete at UCLA. His worst sport might have been baseball. He was a Rose Bowl hero on the football team in 1939. He ran track, he played basketball, and his best sport might have been tennis. After UCLA, he went into the Army. he became a lieutenant, and he was actually court-martialed in Texas because there was a military bus and he refused to move to the back of the bus when he was asked to. This was a military bus and he was a lieutenant. This was about 10 years before Rosa Parks. And then in 1945, he wasn't convicted of the court-martial, so he was honorably discharged. And in 1945, he went and played with the Negro League team, the Kansas City Monarchs. And that's when Jackie Robinson was recruited by Branch Rickey of the Dodgers. So what we're going to talk about today is some stories of hate and bigotry, but we're also going to talk about some grace and humanity that everyday people showed when they decided to do the right thing. So it's 1945, 1947, Major League Baseball. At that time, there were 16 teams, half as many as there are now. And it was concentrated in the Midwest and the Northeast. The teams that were the farthest west were the two teams in St. Louis, the Browns and the Cardinals. And then they were also the only team south of the Mason-Dixon line. On the other hand, most of the minor league teams were in the South, and they were controlled by the Jim Crow laws, which, just to kind of go over quickly, the Jim Crow laws were actually laws. They were statutes, state and local laws, that if you didn't obey them, you could be detained, arrested, jailed, or even beaten or killed. So it wasn't just attitudes. These were laws on the books, and they were enforced by local law enforcement and then also vigilantes like the Ku Klux Klan. So because of that, Branch Rickey made the decision that with Jackie Robinson, we're not going to send him south. We're going to send him to Montreal, Canada. He played minor league ball for 1 year with the Montreal Royals. And that worked well for Jackie Robinson. He still had to take the racial abuse, but it was different in Canada than it was in the southern part of the United States under Jim Crow. The players that came after him did not necessarily get that courtesy. When they signed with a team, they got sent where they got sent. So today, I'm going to talk about three particular players. Two you've probably heard of, one you probably never heard of, and there's a reason you never heard of them. So I got the information from this book. It's called Carrying Jackie's Torch, The Players Who Integrated Baseball and America, and it's by Steve Jacobson. And I had the honor of having Steve on the podcast I host, Leadership Lessons from the Negro Leagues. He was on a February show. And then a week and a half ago, my son and I went on a father-son trip to New York. And we had the pleasure of meeting Steve and his wife, Anita. We had lunch in the Bronx. We were together for about 2 hours. I know he's 90 years old, and she is about 90 years old. And we just had this amazing time where they talked about him being a sports writer in New York during the 1960s and 70s. And anybody that follows sports and the media, New York was like it probably still is, but at that time when the newspapers were big, this Steve Jacobson was just into everything. And it was just, we heard some amazing stories. So I'm going to use him as a source. And like I said, talk about three ball players. Now, the first I'm going to talk about is a ball player named Charles Murray. Now, Charles Murray, in some ways, was a lot like Jackie Robinson. He grew up in Southern California. He went to integrated schools. He went to movies, restaurants. Usually things happen without incident. He got drafted and signed by, they didn't have a draft yet. So he got signed by the Houston Colts. And Janice referred to the Houston Colts that later became the Houston Astros. So the first year 1963, he's in Modesto, like about 90 miles away from here. And it's fantastic. He has a good year. Everything goes well. He gets promoted and he ends up in Georgia. In Georgia, he had a great manager. And the manager worked with him. That was a good relationship. But he had to deal with the Jim Crow laws. And what typically would happen as far as getting meals go is when an integrated team pulled into a town and they went to a restaurant and that restaurant didn't serve African Americans, well, one of the teammates would go in, they would get takeout, bring it back on the bus. The African American ball player would eat on the bus. And then sometimes the white ball player would stay on the bus with the African American player. They'd keep each other company. And a lot of times it worked. Well, with Charles Murray, he was a proud man and it didn't work. He basically said, if the restaurant's going to slam the door on me, I'm going to slam the bus door on the restaurant. And he'd just skip meals. And, you know, you're a 20-year-old kid. I know what I was like when I was 20. And you don't skip meals. But he did it. He was a proud man. And he finally said, I'm finished with this. And in Steve Jacobson's book, he quotes Murray as saying, you know, I played ball growing up, but I also had jobs. I did other things. And it's not like if I don't play Major League Baseball, my life's over. And pretty much things worked out for him. Interesting story. Charles Murray is the brother of Eddie Murray. And Eddie Murray is about 10 years younger than Charles Murray. And Eddie's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He played for the Baltimore Orioles and the Dodgers. But anyway, when Eddie was playing for the Baltimore Orioles, Charles moved to Baltimore to be close to him, got a job at FEMA as a security guard, and then became a correctional officer. So he lived a satisfying life, but he never played Major League Baseball. So who lost? He did all right. He got out of a situation he didn't like. Well, everybody lost. First of all, if Charles Murray says that it was okay that he didn't play baseball, I don't believe him. If you're that good of a ball player where you've got the potential to make the major leagues, even if there's a slight chance, you're really good. And you're probably competitive enough where you want to see how your skills match up with the major leaguers. So I think deep down, he wanted his shot. Baseball lost. Anytime I do research on anything in baseball, or anytime I'm just curious about something, I go to Baseball Reference. And Baseball Reference has everything. You play in the major leagues for 3 days, you're in Baseball Reference. You play in the major leagues for 25 years, you're in Baseball Reference. Well, Charles Murray isn't in Baseball Reference because he never played Major League Baseball, and he probably could have. Third, the fans lost. So we'll go back to Janice when she was talking about her first baseball game in Houston. Well, what if Charles Murray became a Houston Colt or a Houston Astro? Willie Mays was a San Francisco Giant. I wanted Michael talked about this, Scott talked about this. The three of us, when we were growing up, we wanted everything that had to do with Willie Mays. What if Janice was growing up in Houston and her hero was Charles Murray? Well, that never happened. And it's tragic. So Charles Murray was the biggest victim, but everybody lost during these times of hate and bigotry. So that's the Charles Murray story. And now I'm going to go to somebody you probably heard of, and that's Maury Wills. Maury Wills was a Los Angeles Dodger. That would be the next slide. Back a little bit. Right there. He was a Los Angeles Dodger. By the time I started collecting baseball cards, he was on the Pittsburgh Pirates. Maury Wills grew up in Washington, D.C. in extreme poverty. When he went into professional baseball, it was in Fort Worth. There was a trip to Shreveport, Louisiana, when the traveling secretary was passing out hotel keys. He not only didn't have one for Maury Wills, he had no suggestions on where Maury Wills was going to sleep that night. So Wills was relegated to just walking the streets of Shreveport, and he was knocking on people's door. He was supported by a trainer on the team who was keeping him company and just kind of staying with him for the evening. But breakfast the next morning were Oreo cookies and milk he got from a drugstore. And he was reprimanded for being late to the ballpark because he couldn't find a black taxi. Will said, I always had the feeling that I was less than. I just wanted to go home. Now, most minor league ball players are like 20 years old. Do you remember when you were 20? And it's hard enough to get things going, but to have the whole world against you, I could completely understand. I just wanted to go home. Well, anyway, the good news was he was managed by a friendly manager. And Will said that his manager, Bobby Bragan, was fantastic. And the reason Bobby Bragan liked Maury Wills is because he saw a lot of his own game when he was young in the way Maury Wills played baseball. And Wills said, Bragan said to me, if you correct this one thing, you'll go far. Will said, I corrected that and I had an outstanding year. So he ended up in the major leagues. And the story about Bobby Bragan is a story about growth and evolution. Now, Bobby Bragan was on that Brooklyn Dodger team in 1947 that Jackie Robinson debuted with. And he signed the famous petition that the Dodgers circulated that many of them didn't want to play with an African-American ball player. He signed that petition. And now 11 years later, he's paving the way for Maury Wills to make the major leagues. They asked Wills about it, and Wills said, he was a great man to me. He made it possible for me to get to the big leagues. The story of Bobby Bragan is absolutely amazing. He was born in 1917 in Birmingham. And as life went on, he started a foundation. And the foundation was for youth from all walks of life. Every year they honor somebody special, a big supporter. One year they honored Rachel Robinson, Jackie Robinson's widow. They honored Charlie Pride, who was the first African-American inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. And then Charlie Pride also played Negro League Baseball. They honored Maury Wills himself. When they asked Bragan just straight up, why did you sign the petition? He said, I didn't know any better at the time. I just thought it was something I was supposed to do. So what's the end result? Maury Wills played 14 years in the major leagues. He won the most valuable player once. He won the World Series 3 times and was manager for 1 year with the Seattle Mariners. So a great career, not quite a Hall of Fame career, but a great career where he collaborated with a coach that evolved and grew. Now, the third person I'm going to put up, or I'm going to ask Craig to put up, is somebody we all know, and that's Willie McCovey, Stretch. The late mayor, George Moscone, called Willie McCovey a San Francisco institution like the Golden Gate Bridge. Willie Mays is the greatest Giant. Willie McCovey might be the most beloved Giant. He's just somebody that everybody loved. And he grew up in Mobile, Alabama. And as he was growing up, he developed the street smarts and the skills to navigate through Jim Crow. He was playing minor league baseball in Sandersville, Georgia. He also had a friendly manager named Pete Pavlik. Now, it was a supportive situation on the ball field, and Mr. Pavlik's wife was also really supportive. And she was the type of person that just wanted to do everything she could to support the team. So if she's driving through Sandersville, Georgia, and she sees one of the ball players walking home, she'll offer him a ride, the friendly thing to do. Well, that just scared the heck out of Willie McCovey because he said, there's nothing that draws attention to law enforcement officers or vigilantes more than a black man in the car with a white woman. So he didn't know what to do. Do I disrespect Mrs. Pavlik for the generosity of offering a ride? Or do I take the ride and risk being detained, beaten, or worse? So it's like every day, Willie McCovey woke up just trying to figure out how to mind his own business and stay alive for the day. So how did it all work out? Well, statistically, this is going to be probably the only time I talk about numbers because I'm more of a story guy than a numbers guy. But statistically, the integration of baseball was just off the charts. In that 1947 year, Jackie Robinson won the Rookie of the Year. Both the American League and National League give out the Rookie of the Year every year. In 1959, Willie McCovey won the Rookie of the Year. Now, Major League Baseball also gives out the Most Valuable Player. Jackie Robinson won the Most Valuable Player in 1949, and then Willie McCovey won the Most Valuable Player in 1969. As I mentioned, Maury Wills won the Most Valuable Player Award in 1962. Now, I'm going to just digress a little bit. That worked out because he got the Most Valuable Player, but the Giants beat the Dodgers in the playoffs and went to the World Series. So I'm happy, Maury Wills is happy, and that works out. But anyway, it was just amazing the success of the African-American ball players. For the Rookies of the Year, each league gives out one every year. And from 1947 to 1960, 9 of the most valuable players were black. 9 of the Rookie of the Year players were black. It was just incredible. And then in 1956 was the first year that Major League Baseball gave out one Cy Young Award, and that goes to the best pitcher in baseball. And the winner that year was one of Jackie Robinson's African-American teammates, Don Newcomb. And he not only won the Cy Young for best pitcher that year, he won Most Valuable Player. So on the field, it could not have worked out any better. As we move on, there are still work to do that I'll talk about later. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of forces are coming together on the day of this presentation. And then last night we got word that Willie Mays passed away. And I'm going to kind of deviate from the script I had because I want to talk a little bit about Willie Mays, who he came in under totally different circumstances than Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson came into Major League Baseball in 1947, college graduate, military veteran. Willie Mays was 20 years old when he came into the major leagues in 1951. He had played Negro League baseball for a year or two when he was like 17 or 18 years old with the Birmingham Black Barons. So immensely talented. He actually went into the Army in 1952 and 1953 after he came into the major leagues. But 2 weeks ago, the Giants had a bobblehead night for Willie Mays. And let's see if the lighting works on this. But this is Willie in his Birmingham Black Barons uniform, and he wore the number 8. He wasn't 24 in the Negro Leagues. He wore the number 8. And we talked about the first game, and my dad took me to my first game on October 1st, 1965. I've got that date in my mind, and I didn't know it at the time, or I didn't comprehend it at the time, but that was a big weekend because there were like three games left, and the Giants were just like one game behind the Dodgers. So Friday night was a big game. And they were playing the Cincinnati Reds, who had great players. They had Frank Robinson, they had Pete Rose, a lot of great players. And Giants lost that game 17-2. They were just crushed. So it was like, I'll never forget the first game. But what I really won't forget is we sat down on our seats before the game, and I remember the atmosphere. You walk in, and the first thing you would see, and when you're a kid, you can't comprehend this, especially then, because we all had black and white TVs. So at Candlestick Park, you walk in the door. They actually had doors in the section. So you walk up the stairs, and you have to open like these push doors. And then you see the light on the field, and it's just spectacular. The stadium lights going down on the field. And then at that time, people brought their transistor radio to the game. And they'd have it was a little bigger than a cell phone, and you put it in the pocket here. And you heard the broadcasters. So there was Russ Hodges, who was a legendary broadcaster. And then you sit down, and my dad got me a hot dog. And then the other thing that you don't do anymore, you don't notice anymore, but without even thinking about it, you're smelling all the cigarette and cigar smoke. Everybody in the ballpark. And that was it in 1965, whether you were indoors or outdoors, you were always around cigarette smoke. But it was unforgettable. My dad, I remember we're sitting there about a half an hour before the game, and he said, "See number 24 out there? That's Willie Mays." And it was like, I'm just short of my 8th birthday. So that was my experience. One of the things I learned it studying Negro League baseball, but I kind of had that instinct my whole life. We're all unique people. So we have stereotypes that if certain people go through certain experiences, they're probably similar personalities. You probably couldn't find two more different people than Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays. Not that one was right and one was wrong. It's just they're two different people. In fact, Jackie Robinson, who grew up in African American in Southern California in the 1920s, probably had more in common with Branch Rickey, who grew up in the 1870s and 80s in Ohio, because they had their religious beliefs in common. But as far as Jackie goes, Jackie always spoke his mind. Sometimes he rocked the boat, and Willie Mays did things more quietly. Michael Milski, I think you pronounce the last name, talked about when Willie couldn't get a house. And this was incredible. The Giants were moving from New York to San Francisco. And what's the first thing you do when you relocate? You have to find a new place to live. And Willie and his wife found a house in the St. Francis Wood area of San Francisco. The owner sold it to him, or agreed to sell it to him, but the neighbors collaborated on stopping it. And Willie didn't start going out and making protests or anything like that, but he just quietly said, "No, I need this house. I want this house." And they said, "Well, we'll find you a place somewhere else." "No, I want this house." And Major League Baseball got into it, the head office in New York, and they wrote to Mayor Christopher in San Francisco, and they basically said, "Hey, you told us you can handle a major league team, and their best player can't find a place to live. What are you going to do?" And Willie and his wife Marguerite got that house. And then later, there was a serious racial incident with the Giants. In the 1960s, the Giants were leaders in having Black and Latin ball players. And they had a manager named Alvin Dark. And he went off on an interview in New York. You know, sometimes people get interviewed and they just go off. And he went off one night. And at the time, the Giants were a really good team. They had just been to the World Series. And he said, essentially, we're having trouble with the Black and Latin players. They don't seem to have the work ethic or the passion that the white players do. And he didn't allow the Latin players to speak Spanish in the clubhouse. He didn't allow Latin music. And it was interesting because at that point in time, the best players on the team were, the reason the Giants were winning is because of the Black and Latin players. But anyway, that's what he said. Well, there was a rebellion. They had players like Orlando Cepeda and Felipe Alou, and they said, no, we're not doing this. And they were ready to do just an absolute mutiny. And Willie called a meeting, and they all got together. He got everybody on the same page. They committed to compete, and they committed to keep everything moving forward. At the end of the year, Alvin Dark got fired, and things moved on. But that's how Willie did it. He did it quietly. You find out about things maybe 30 years later, 50 years later, reading books. Jackie Robinson, on the other hand, he was out there. He marched with Martin Luther King. He sometimes got irritated with Willie Mays because Willie Mays wasn't as vocal as Jackie Robinson was. And to the end, the last time we saw Jackie Robinson was in, I think, 1972. He threw out the first ball for a World Series game. They talked to him and they asked him how he feels about baseball now. He said, things are moving forward, things are good, but I'm not going to be satisfied until I look at the third base line and see a black manager. So there was a lot of African Americans excelling in Major League Baseball, but it was 5 years after that when Frank Robinson became manager, the first black manager in Major League Baseball. He was with the Cleveland Indians. So we're all unique individuals. We all handle things differently. I'm going to step away from the presentation now. I would love to take some questions, and after the questions, I'll finish up and do a little closing. So back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. For the individuals that have questions, and I know there are going to be many, if you could use the reaction figure so that you raise your hand, it helps me see. There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much. So I see that Craig Stewart Adams has the first question. So Steve, take it away.
Craig, well, Steve, Craig. I do have a question, and this is this picture of you and your son. I'm going to share the screen again. Did you go over this, Steve?
Yeah.
I missed
that was
it.
One of the things I went off script when we got the news about Willie Mays. But one of the things, so Michael McKee, Scott Happ, and we all grew up together, and we were all inspired by Willie Mays and Willie McCovey. Well, Phil was born in 1987. Mays had been retired for 14 years. McCovey had been retired for about 6 years before Phil was even born. But he just saw videos and just heard stories, and he was inspired by Willie McCovey. And we went to Cooperstown that year. That was a year Dennis Eckersley of the A's went in, and we went there, and Phil and his friend Dustin were just these crazy autograph hounds, and they caught up with Willie McCovey, and there it is. My son Phil at 17 years old, and he's with McCovey.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I see Alan Garber. Alan, you're on.
Hi, Steve. Thank you
Alan.
for the presentation. As I told you, I'm a lifelong Boston Red Sox fan, and always preferred the American League over the National League. And I was a season ticket holder at the Oakland A's for about 20, 25 years. And I'd like to know your take on the situation with the A's and moving to Las Vegas and how that whole fiasco went on that Oakland lost the team.
Yeah, I'm frustrated because it's a trend right now. They're the third team that goes. The Warriors, that was sort of, I guess, manageable. They're in San Francisco, so
Right.
But it was still, they had a home in Oakland, and it seemed like Oakland fit the Warriors for a long time.
Yeah.
And then the Raiders, Michael Scott and I all grew up with the Raiders too, and we were passionate about the Raiders, so that was sad. The A's one really bothers me because I'm very unhappy with the owner. He doesn't seem to be a baseball person. In fact,
Correct.
the deal in Oakland at the Howard Terminal, I think he looked at that more as a real estate deal than a baseball deal. So
exactly, yes.
Right. So everybody's talking about a ballpark, and he's all right. Well, I'm going to do this shopping center, but yeah, okay, you can have a ballpark. The crazy thing is, I think Las Vegas is getting buyer's remorse. So this is really interesting. And then my son always says the best thing. The one whose picture you saw, he said, you know what? The A's are halfway decent this year. It would be really good if maybe they don't make the playoffs this year, but next year, what if they hosted a playoff game in that minor league stadium in Sacramento, and they have like 12,000 people at a playoff game?
I had the exact same thought. I mentioned that to a friend of mine just 2 days ago, that it would be great if they had the World Series in a 12,000 seats ballpark. Right. I think that they would move the World Series over to San Francisco, probably.
Yeah, or if they had it in Sacramento. Who's the one, I didn't write down the name, that said no game is ever sold out?
Right. Yes.
It's like 12,000. That might that might get it. But then my brother said something, and he said, everybody talks about Oakland not having an interest in baseball, but they've had like 5 or 6 ownership groups, from Charlie Finley to the one now. And every ownership group did nothing but complain, just always complained. And the one ownership group that did not complain, that just wanted to be part of the community, was the Haas family.
Haas, right.
Right. And they would get 2.5 million people out to the Coliseum every year.
Exactly.
So, I mean, attitude means so much. So anyway, thank you for the question and the comment.
Right.
Thank you, Alan. And Suzanne, you're on.
I love this, Steve. I so wish my brother, the Cub fan, was here. But you mentioned a site that was baseball, and I want to send that to him. Is it a .com? Wait.
I think it's baseballreference.org.
Oh, baseballreference.org.
But if he just goes to Google and writes baseball reference,
okay,
it'll get there.
This was a history lesson, lest we think it was just a baseball lesson. And like you said, the leadership lesson. And I'm going to tell you, I was lucky enough to speak in Kansas City at, is it 14th or 18th and Vine, and go to that wonderful museum of the Negro Leagues, where you saw the baseball players. And you make me treasure that memory. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Michael Milstein. Michael. Oh, Michael, you're on mute.
Steve, I enjoyed your talk very much. It seems there's a lot fewer black baseball players these days. I'm thinking it's because kids growing up are more interested in football and basketball than baseball. But can you think of any reason why there's so few black players now?
That's a good question. Another thing about Willie Mays is when he went into baseball, he was good enough to be, he was a high school quarterback, And I think he played other positions. He did other sports really well. In those days, if you were going to make a living in sports, baseball was the only way to go. That was where you made a living, and football and basketball weren't as big. So it might be more opportunities in different sports. That's another presentation because there's just so many things going on right now. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago. It was actually in Cooperstown. I was at the Hall of Fame. There's an organization called the Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference with a lot of different researchers. And I'm nowhere near as much of a researcher as some of these authors are. But one person got up and spoke, and he talked about travel baseball. And when Michael, Scott, and I were growing up, baseball was going to the park, playing. People got good. They got noticed in high school, and they went on. And right now, when you're 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, you're playing in these little leagues and Babe Ruth leagues. And then your whole weekend is going up to Sacramento, going to Antioch, going somewhere to play baseball. And not everybody can do that. There's an amazing number of baseball players that came out of Oakland, from Frank Robinson to Ricky Henderson. And they all developed their reputations, their skills, just playing in local leagues. Every organization in Oakland, Mother's Cookies, Lay's Potato Chips, they all ran a baseball team. And if you were good, you got noticed just in your hometown, and then you went on to high school, college, or signed a contract. So it's different now, and it's more business-like to get noticed. But there's a lot of things involved. And some of it is, some people think it's more cooler to be an NFL quarterback than it is to be a baseball player. There's just all different reasons. Thanks for the question.
And I see Ms. Fripp has her hand raised.
Well, thank you, Steve. This has been absolute spectacular presentation. Love your stories and your research. And thank you. A couple more of your fans turned up, Patricia and Jen. And we've got a few more of our members who came in late, Lauren Ward, and of course, Claudette Good O'Neill and Doug Bowers. So you've got a crowd. So my question of you is, when did you start researching and talking about this subject?
Thank you for the question. The pandemic, there's a lot of things that happened with the pandemic, but one of the things we had to do was we had to find things that we can do indoors. And I had started a podcast a few years ago. That was sort of a Toastmasters project I did. And it was even before the pandemic. And I would just talk to some of my Toastmasters friends, then make it into a podcast. And it was different subjects, but then I decided my passion, sports. And then I got involved with this internet radio station that wanted to bring in something on Negro League Baseball. And I really didn't know anything about it. But what I found out is that in this day of social media, LinkedIn and things like that, you can find guests. So I found that if I could reach out to people, I could have a guest on, and all I had to do was ask questions and they could provide the information. And we started leadership lessons from the Negro Leagues. And then I did this radio station for like 6 months, and then decided not to do it anymore and just did the podcast on my own. But I've always been passionate about sports, and I got into this niche about 2.5 years ago. Thank you, Patricia.
And I see that Alan Garber has his hand up.
Yeah. Steve, I just have another comment. As I said in the beginning, I live up here in Sonoma, and we have a local baseball team here, the Sonoma Stompers, that I volunteer at. It's a California Collegiate League, and they have about 8 teams up here in Northern California. And it's a lot of fun. I volunteer there, work there. I run the box office, actually, sell the tickets. And so if you ever want to come up here, between now and the end of July, on the weekends, we have every night, we have a weekend, we have games, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, home games. I'd like you to come up here and you can be my guest.
I'd love to do it. If you could put your contact information in the chat, I'll get back to you. That'd
I
be
will.
great.
I'll give you my phone number and my email.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Now, Suzanne, yes, you have your hand up. Suzanne.
Okay. I have another question. Didn't they recently, was it in the last 2 weeks, that the Major League Baseball decided to include the stats from the Negro Leagues?
Yes, that's.
Tell me how that will impact.
Well, it's a big deal. I was going to spend more time in that too, and then things changed last night. But this has been going on for a while, and it was about 3 weeks ago where they made the announcement, and they didn't just rush into this. There's when I was at the conference a couple of weeks ago, they actually had a panel, and there's this statistical site called Seamheads. There's all these numbers and analytic people get on, and they are figuring out ways to apply the stats so it makes sense and they're as accurate they can be. And they need things like, if you read an article in the paper that Willie Mays hit a home run for the Birmingham Black Barons, that's interesting. But they also want a box score because they want to know he hit it. They want to know the pitcher that gave it up, and they want to know who won the game. They want to be able to tie the whole knot. So they put a lot of work into it. And it's created a lot of conversation because I had one person say to me, well, it's two different leagues. You can't compare. But baseball's always been like that. Until recently, it used to be that the American League and the National League were totally separate. So Babe Ruth happened to be the #1 home run hitter, but there was also a leading home run hitter in the National League. And then every league had their own set of things, but they were all major leagues. So they're doing the same thing with the Negro Leagues. And then competition-wise, we found out with all the people that won the most valuable player and rookie of the year that you can't say who had the better competition. I mean, this is crazy to say, but who played against better people, Babe Ruth or Josh Gibson of the Negro Leagues? Because it seemed like everybody won the most valuable player when baseball was integrated. So it's going to be an interesting thing, but the best part is it's going to start positive arguments, because there's nothing better than a good sports argument that's good-natured. So it's only going to make things good. And then the families of these ball players, their family members getting recognition.
Will they get a benefit? Because maybe I'm making this up, but I seem to remember they wanted Satchel Paige to get some of the benefits. So they brought him back in his older years to play a couple of games. Will there be any benefits for these players? There
could be. There's been a major league pension, and they're trying to figure out something with that. There's an association with descendants of Negro League ball players that is talking to Major League Baseball about things like that. And they're also talking about licensing. Major League Baseball is selling a lot of Negro League memorabilia. And that's nice. That's nice recognition. But Major League Baseball was also the people that didn't allow them to play Major League Baseball. So the families are kind of saying, all right, you can do that. We need to be part of the discussion. And marketing people will always do something like that. Well, we're going to make a profit on this. But you were the problem that made this situation happen. So it's kind of interesting, the back and forth on it. But a lot of progress has been making. And there's also a lot of, in this world of social media, there's a lot of trolls out there that are not arguing. They're saying inappropriate things.
So Janelle,
Thank you.
See, Janelle has her hand up. Janelle.
Thank you. I love this. I'm really not a particular baseball fan, but I'm so intrigued by the people who broke the color barrier. In fact, I'm very interested in how the color barrier has been broken in so many areas, and how I don't know if it's these people are really extra special. And I know Jackie Robinson had to put up with a lot to ignore what was happening to him. But I notice in so many situations that people the African Americans who break the color barrier, there's something that is so different and special about them. And I've often wondered if it wasn't what they went through. I watched the Saturday night program with Biden and Obama and a few other celebrities. But when Biden walked on stage, it was, he's a president. It's interesting. And then Obama walks on stage, and the auditorium just went crazy. And I think many of us know what Obama had to go through he was declared not even an American citizen by our friend in the White House 4 years ago. And so many of these people, I wonder if part of their greatness isn't that they had that special something that enabled them to stay with it instead of wanting to go home, that they were willing to fight to break that color barrier, which has been huge in this country, just huge. I don't really think we appreciate how it has been. There was a question in there someplace.
There was definitely something special. Whenever you're the first with something, whether it's President Obama or Jackie Robinson, he made the agreement with Branch Rickey. The guy that got court-martialed for not giving up his seat made the agreement to not fight back for about 3 years, because this had to go smoothly. This was an experiment. If it went poorly, who knows when the next African American players would come in. So he stayed quiet, but about 3 years into the career, Branch Rickey turned him loose. And that's when his really fighting spirit came out. And he was a special person.
And you had to be special to take all of that abuse and hatred that was being.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Right. And it wasn't in his nature to just take it, but he did it for 3 years without fighting back. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And the same thing goes for women who are the first in fields. They really have to put up with a lot, and then they get ignored by history. And it would be so wonderful, I think, to make America great, not again, but great, will be as if we can get rid of these barriers and really use the talent that is present in all the groups that are here. It would be so wonderful if we could do that.
Great point.
Amen.
Amen.
Steve, my contact info is in the chat.
Okay, terrific. I'll get it.
Excellent.
Thanks.
I don't see any hands, but I find Mr. Randall Reeder, Will Rogers, he's got to have a thought or a question on this, because Will always had an opinion or a point of view. So even though he didn't raise his hand, I'm going to put him on the spot here. So Will, give us some thoughts.
Well, yeah, you're putting me on the spot, all right. Will Rogers loved baseball players, and they loved Will Rogers. This was back in 1920s and early 30s, up to 1935. And here's how that worked. Baseball was in the afternoon, and Will entertained at night. So he would go to the baseball games, and then the players would often go to watch Will do his thing in the evening. There's a picture, I don't have it on this computer, of him. Most of you know Will Rogers was a world-class rope artist, wrote trick rope. And there's an entire baseball team, at least a dozen players gathered around him, and Will is above and spinning a rope around that whole team. And that's an amazing photo. I've got it on a different computer. So
Thank you.
somebody, others pointed out, back then, baseball was the sport.
Right.
And Will Rogers had a couple of comments to that effect, that baseball was everything in America.
Thank you, Randall. I knew you had an opinion. I knew Will had an opinion. Oh, and I see, is it Patricia? That's her hand up, please. Patricia.
Yes,
And also Gordon Hill put his hand up a couple of times.
Okay, I missed that. Okay, Patricia, then Gordon Hill.
thank you so much, Steve. I loved everything about this talk. It was so impassioned, and I loved the storytelling, especially. I was thinking about my 16-year-old son who plays baseball and is very passionate about it, but I'm not sure understands all the history, and you have to understand the history to understand how we got where we are today. And so I don't know if it's possible to get the recording, but I would love to share your talk with him. This was a talk, it's tempting to think this was a talk about baseball. For me, it was actually a talk about social justice and inclusion and civil rights wrapped around your very huge passion of baseball. The question that I had is what is the call to action today? In what ways can baseball or other sports keep advancing these causes of social justice and civil rights and inclusion? Does anything come to mind for you?
They're doing some things really well. They're clumsy on other things. And I don't know if I should point to Major League Baseball. It's kind of society in general. What Susan talked about was the statistics. That's really good. And to come up with a clear, concise message on how to interpret them. So people that are skeptical, it could be understandable. And if somebody wants to have a conversation, they can. So that's a good thing. Other good things that are happening is, okay, so in 1947, we're talking about African-American ball players. Then the Latin American ball players came in. Right now, the most compelling player in baseball is Shohei Ohtani, who's from Japan. And my favorite player is a player named Ellie De La Cruz from the Cincinnati Reds. So Japanese player, Latin player, baseball's worldwide. So keep opening it up to the world. And then probably the best thing that can happen is to address the travel ball. And the travel ball is a big deal because my family and I were into it. And we went up, like I said, we go up to Sacramento, we go up to Antioch. We made 2 trips. We went to Salt Lake City one time, and we went to Tucson one time. And those kind of got a little bit pricey. They weren't crazy, but it was a little bit pricey. And not everybody can do that. So Major League Baseball needs to get into it. And then the biggest thing is just the way, and I'm just maybe rambling a little bit now, but society works different now. When I grew up in Alameda, Oakland, right next to us, there was just nothing but industry. There were businesses. There was, like I said, Mother's Cookies, Lay's potato chips, Sunshine Biscuits, and every organization had a youth baseball league or more than one. So my contemporaries in my age group, Ricky Henderson, Dave Stewart, and others, they could all play ball locally. And it was affordable, it was fun, and they learned a lot of things doing that. So the biggest thing is making the availability, I think. And then to keep honoring the past heroes. Talking about Willie Mays and Jackie Robinson, and then honoring the great players that compete in the Negro Leagues that have so far been anonymous.
And Steve, I see Gordon Hill. Gordon, you had a question before I ask Steve to give first concluding remarks.
I have a comment. Prejudice, bias plays such an important role in these situations. In 1952, when I saw Satchel Paige pitch for the Browns and Bob Feller pitch for the Indians, one of the comments after the game, which Satchel won, was, well, it would have been different if Feller had been younger because I think he was 9 and 13 that year. But Satchel Paige was 12 and 10 for the St. Louis Browns at the age of 45. And you said, so if you look at it with reason, race came into the situation. Another interesting situation is that in women's college basketball, there was a young player at the University of Kansas who scored over 4,000 points in her career, which is more than Caitlin Clark played, but her numbers aren't recognized because that was before the NCAA started keeping records, and they don't include the records of the pre-NCAA players. So, but the point is, Major League Baseball, including the black players in their records today, is a great move, which hopefully will extend to other programs. So, and great pride. Thank you for being here today.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the comments.
And Steve, before we adjourn, do you have a concluding remark for us?
Yes, I do. And Janelle alluded to it about the diversity and getting people together. Sometimes diversity gets a bad rap because sometimes people say, all right, we're just artificially putting people into leadership or putting people into Major League Baseball or creating spots. It's not really that. We found that out with Major League Baseball. The thought was these African-American ball players weren't going to fit in. Well, they not only fit in, they excelled. And they excelled because they belonged there. And what basically happened was the diversity was honored and the whole became greater than the sum of the parts. So thank you all for having me today.
Thank you.
And thank you, Steve, so very much. And before you adjourn, of course, I have to ask our president, do you have any concluding remarks for us, or shall we adjourn?
Well, thank
we
you
stay
very
on?
much, Gary. Thank you very much. And Steve, this was a fabulous program. And and yes, for your guests, we do record it, and I will make sure you have the link to share with your fans.
Could we stay on a little bit longer?
I can stay on.
Turn off the recording and we can just baseball talk.
Okay, great. I'm going to just do one thing, though. I've got the computer where I'm standing up and I just want to sit down. So I'm going to just take a little tweak here. But if you just give me a second.
Get comfortable.
I've got a complicated contraption here.